There's a question I get almost every day. And it doesn't matter how old the person is. It could be someone who's 20, 40, 60, 80. Deep down, almost everyone carries this doubt inside themselves. Does a soulmate really exist? And I realize that a lot of people spend their whole lives waiting to find that perfect person, as if at some point someone would show up and automatically fill every void. Understand everything, never disappoint, never get tired, never fail. But real life doesn't work like that. And maybe one of people's biggest frustrations today is exactly this impossible expectation they've created about love. Because since we were little, we were taught to believe the idea of Prince Charming, the ideal person, the kind of love that solves everything on its own. But when real life together begins, reality shows up. I find it curious how so many people say they want to find their soulmate, but deep down they're looking for someone who never disagrees with them, never disappoints them, never shows the human flaws that everyone has. And that's when the problem starts, because when the passion fades, and it always does, the person looks at the other person and thinks, this isn't what I imagined. But no one can keep up the fantasy forever. I'm going to say something that might disappoint some people, but I truly believe it. A soulmate in the idealized sense of the word doesn't exist. What exists are kindred spirits. People who cross our lives because there is some lesson, some emotional bond, some healing, some growth journey happening there. And that completely changes the way we see relationships. Because instead of asking, is this person going to make me happy forever? The question becomes, what did this relationship come to teach me? And that's much deeper. I see a lot of people stuck in a constant state of waiting, almost as if life is incomplete until the ideal person shows up. And while waiting for this impossible perfection, you let real people, real connections, real stories pass you by. The other day, a woman wrote to me saying, Sigana, I'm already over 60 years old and I've never found my soulmate. And that made me think a lot, because maybe she has actually met important people. But she rejected all of them because none of them fit into that fanciful idea of absolute perfection. But human love isn't perfection. Life together isn't perfection. After all, two people carry different stories, different pains, different fears, different flaws. And even so, they still try to build something together. That's a real relationship. The person who has a strong spiritual connection with you won't necessarily be perfect. Sometimes they will even touch exactly the parts of you that need to mature the most. And that can be very uncomfortable. Because there are relationships that come into our lives not just to bring comfort, but to help us grow. But nowadays, a lot of people want to have relationships without any emotional depth. Everything has become fast, disposable, superficial. It's hooking up, letting go, moving on to the next one. But some connections hit differently. You feel it. It's not just physical attraction. It's not just uncontrollable passion. There's a strange sense of familiarity. It's like that person accesses parts of you that almost no one else really understands. And usually that's accompanied by genuine reciprocity. Not perfection, reciprocity. Because when there is a kindred spirit, there is give and take, there is growth, there is understanding, there is real presence, even with flaws. One thing I started to realize over time is that almost no one comes into our lives by chance. And I'm not saying this in a fanciful way, no. I'm talking about those connections that seem to touch us in a place that's hard to explain. Because there are people you meet and nothing happens. The conversation doesn't flow. The energy doesn't match. Everything feels distant. Some people enter your life in unexpected ways. as if there was already some familiarity there even before you started spending time together. A lot of people have felt that. Sometimes you meet someone and it feels like that person understands parts of you that you usually hide from the rest of the world. Not because they're perfect, not because it turned into a fairy tale, but because there's a connection. And I think people often confuse connection with passion. Passion is something explosive. It stirs up ego, anxiety, neediness, desire. The person loses all sense, does crazy things, creates fantasies, but many times it ends as quickly as it began. Now, when there's a deeper connection, it's different. You feel at peace around the person. You feel understood. You feel that it's mutual. And reciprocity has become something rare these days because a lot of people get into relationships wanting to receive everything without building anything together. They want someone to heal their emotional pain, to fill their emptiness, to carry their insecurities, to keep them happy all the time. But no healthy relationship works like that. The other day I was thinking about how people are emotionally exhausted precisely because they've placed impossible expectations on relationships. They want someone who never disappoints, never makes mistakes, never changes, never gets tired. But that doesn't exist. A real relationship is about sharing everyday life, and everyday life reveals sides that infatuation never shows at the beginning. You really get to know someone when problems, difficulties, differences, routine, and wear and tear arise. That's when the emotional maturity of both people shows up. Because a kindred spirit isn't someone who will never hurt you. It's the person who stays and keeps building together, even knowing that both are imperfect. And honestly, I think that nowadays a lot of people have completely lost the sense of what it means to build a relationship. Everything has become disposable. If it requires patience, they give up. If it requires dialogue, they give up. If it requires maturity, they give up. But no deep connection survives without that. I see people waiting for someone perfect while they themselves remain emotionally unavailable, carrying old traumas, fear of trusting, fear of vulnerability, but expecting love to come fully formed. And human love doesn't come ready-made. It grows through day-to-day life, in the little things, in caring, in being present. There's a huge difference between someone who only triggers your anxiety and someone who truly brings peace to your life. And I think a lot of people have already confused one for the other. Because intensity doesn't mean true connection. Sometimes the person who messes you up emotionally the most is exactly the one who has the least to do with your growth. But since there's neediness, desire, and ego involved, it seems like love. But when there's real connection, you can tell by the way the relationship unfolds. There's give and take, there's care, there's effort from both sides, and not that constant feeling of begging for someone's presence, attention, or affection, because no one should have to beg for love in a relationship. No. One of the biggest illusions people have created about love is believing that a relationship is meant to fill a void. And maybe that's exactly why so many people get hurt. Because they enter a relationship expecting to be saved emotionally, as if someone's arrival would solve insecurity, loneliness, fear, neediness, and lack of direction. All at once. But no one can carry that weight without the relationship becoming unhealthy. I've seen a lot of good people completely lose themselves trying to make someone else their source of happiness. And when that happens, a very dangerous emotional dependency begins. The person starts living for the relationship based on the other person's mood, on the other person's presence, on the other person's validation, and without realizing it, they stop existing as an individual. Then any distance turns into despair. Any argument feels like abandonment. Any change is frightening. She doesn't only love the other person. She made the other person responsible for emotionally sustaining something that she can't even sustain within herself. And that never ends well. There's a phrase that I repeat to myself a lot. No one can build a healthy relationship without first learning how to exist alone. And existing alone doesn't mean living without anyone. It means not turning a relationship into an emotional crutch. Because when two people come together just out of neediness, the tendency is for the relationship to become a cycle of demands. Demands for attention, demands for presence, demands for perfection, and the more demands, the more wear and tear. The other day I was thinking about how people today have completely forgotten how to build connections slowly. Everything has become immediate. Met today, and by tomorrow they're already imagining an entire future together. They barely even know who the other person is. But they've already built up expectations, fantasies, and emotional dependency. And exaggerated expectations destroy a lot of relationships before they even really begin. Because the person doesn't fall in love with reality. They fall in love with the image they've created. Then when everyday life reveals the real human being, tired, imperfect, full of flaws, frustration comes. But truly loving someone requires maturity to see the humanity in the other person. And humanity includes flaws, limits, difficulties, differences. The problem is that a lot of people want to receive love, but they don't know how to live with imperfection. They want someone who is emotionally available all the time, patient all the time, present all the time. But no one can keep that up 24 hours a day. That's where something very important about kindred spirits comes in. When there's a true connection, you realize that the relationship goes beyond immediate passion. There's a desire to build, to stay, to grow together, even during difficult times, because real life together isn't made up of only beautiful moments. There's wear and tear too. There are differences, there are bad days. But when there's emotional maturity on both sides, the relationship doesn't turn into a war because of that. I see a lot of people confusing love with intense suffering, as if the more difficult and painful it is, the more real it would be. But honestly, a healthy relationship brings peace too. Not perfect peace, not the absence of problems, but that feeling that you can breathe around the person without having to pretend to be another version of yourself all the time. And that's rare these days, because people are emotionally tired, traumatized. So often they meet someone good, but they sabotage the relationship because they've forgotten how to believe in true reciprocity. There are couples that you look at from the outside and you can already tell that no one there is truly happy. And you don't even need to spend much time with them to feel that. You can notice it in the way they talk to each other, in the heavy silence, in how little patience they have, even with the little things. But even so, they stay together. And sometimes it's not even about love anymore. It's habit. It's fear of starting all over again, fear of growing old alone. Fear of admitting that you kept holding on to a story that ended a long time ago. I think it's sad when a relationship gets to that point because people slowly fade away without realizing it. First, they stop really talking to each other. Then they stop sharing things about their lives. Then there comes a time when they become almost like roommates. And even so, they keep going. The other day I saw a woman saying she couldn't remember the last time she felt desired by her own husband. That got to me because she spoke as if it were normal. And I said, but affection, attention, and emotional connection just simply disappear after a while. But it shouldn't be like that. A relationship can't survive on obligation alone. You can even stay by someone's side for years. But if there's no more admiration, presence, or genuine exchange, being together starts to become a silent burden. And the worst part is that a lot of people become bitter without even realizing it. The person starts to treat love as an inevitable disappointment. They start to lose faith in connection. They become cold. But sometimes she didn't really become cold. She just spent too much time trying to survive in relationships that drained her emotionally. I see a lot of people confusing suffering with depth, as if true love had to be complicated, painful, unstable all the time. But honestly, a healthy relationship brings peace too. Not perfect peace. Not the absence of problems, but that feeling of being able to let your guard down around the person without having to live in a state of emotional hypervigilance. And that's worth its weight in gold. Because there are relationships that do exactly the opposite. The person gets anxious waiting for a message. Insecure all the time, trying to guess their mood, trying not to bother them, trying to deserve emotional scraps. That gets exhausting on a level that slowly destroys your self-esteem. And here's the truth. No one should have to beg someone to be present in a relationship. When there's reciprocity, you can feel it. You don't have to keep interpreting silence all the time. You don't have to keep trying to force someone to show affection. You don't have to feel like you're fighting alone to keep the relationship alive. But a lot of people accept much less than they deserve because they're afraid of losing, and fear is a terrible place to build love. Because when someone lives in fear of abandonment, she starts to tolerate things that hurt deeply just so she won't be alone. Then she starts to lose herself, giving in, swallowing her sadness. Until one day she realizes that she lost her own identity within the relationship. And maybe that's why so many people talk about soulmates these days. Because deep down, everyone wants to find someone with whom they can finally feel emotionally at ease. Someone who doesn't turn love into a daily battle. Someone who makes being together feel like shelter, not a battle. In the end, I think most people aren't looking for perfection. They're looking for peace. It's just that they've spent so much time in confusing, exhausting, and superficial relationships that they started to believe love has to hurt. And maybe that's one of the biggest mistakes, because suffering for someone is easy. What's hard is actually building something truly healthy. What's hard is finding someone willing to stay when the initial passion fades and day-to-day life starts to reveal who both people really are. Because that's when everything changes. Most relationships feel intense at first. There's novelty, expectation, fantasy. The problem is that fantasy doesn't sustain a long-term relationship. There comes a time when the person will show how they are when they're tired, how they react on bad days, how they treat you during difficult times, how they deal with frustration, how they talk when there's a problem. And that's when you understand if there's really a deep connection or just a passing infatuation. I find it curious how so many people spend years looking for the right person, but almost never ask themselves, does this relationship bring me peace or just anxiety? Because that changes everything. There are relationships where you're on alert all the time, waiting for messages, trying to interpret silence, trying not to make mistakes, trying not to push the person away. And it wears you down mentally to an absurd degree. Now, when there's real reciprocity, you feel emotional security. You don't have to compete for attention. You don't have to beg for affection. You don't have to diminish yourself to fit into someone else's life. And honestly, that means more today than any kind of intensity. I've seen people who are extremely in love living completely unhappy lives. And I've also seen simple, calm relationships without any spectacle but full of respect, partnership, and real presence. In the end, that's what sustains a life together, because looks change, phases change, life changes. But character, care, and reciprocity are still the foundation of any healthy relationship. And maybe that's exactly why I don't believe in this fanciful idea of a perfect soulmate. I think there are people who come into our lives because there's emotional connection, learning, growth, and genuine exchange. Kindred spirits. People who are able to walk together without needing to destroy each other in the process. And even these relationships will have difficulties sometimes. There will be strain, disagreements, and rough patches because human relationships are made by imperfect people. But there's a huge difference between facing difficulties together and constantly living in emotional suffering. I think a lot of people need to understand this before spending years holding on to relationships that no longer make sense, because love shouldn't make you lose your own peace. It shouldn't make you feel inadequate all the time. It shouldn't turn life together into emotional survival. Deep down, maybe recognizing a kindred spirit is realizing exactly that. You don't have to abandon who you are to stay by that person's side. There's room for both to truly exist, and that's rare nowadays. If you want me to keep making videos like this, talking about relationships, emotional connection, spirituality, and human behavior in a deeper and more realistic way, leave a comment down below.